wrote, "It easily explained why Henry Wallace was the best loved and the best hated man in the stadium." In McCook, Nebraska, a dying Republican liberal senator, George Norris, a great senator, listened to the speech and reached for his pen. "I do not suppose it would be considered a proper speech for that occasion by the politicians," he wrote to Wallace. "If you had been trying to appease somebody, you made a mistake. But you were talking straight into the faces of your enemies who were trying to defeat you. And no matter what they may think or what effect it may have on them, the effect on the country and all those who will read that speech is that it was one of the most courageous exhibitions ever seen at a political convention in this country." Although Wallace fought hard for his ideals, it was also a prophetic speech in that he said as well in that same address, "Issues that will be with us for a generation, perhaps even for 100 years, will take form at this convention and at the November election." And although he did fight hard for his ideals in 1944 at the Democratic Convention and in his doomed presidential campaign in 1948, political defeat was never a personal catastrophe for him. Above all, Wallace understood that there are many ways to be of service to humanity, aside from politics, and he devoted himself to that end before, during, and after his public service career. In late 1940, for example, just after he had been elected vice president, but before he had been sworn in that capacity, President Roosevelt asked him to serve as his personal representative to the inauguration of a new president of Mexico. Wallace and his wife Ilo got in their green Plymouth in Washington, D.C. and drove all the way to Mexico City. No Secret Service, no advance men, and in the car behind him was Jim LaCrone and his wife from Des Moines, one of his close friends and aides. And that was all. Now, when he got there, there were riots regarding that election, but he did an incredible job of calming those fears and solidifying a pro-American presidential situation, which was extremely critical on the eve of World War II and where there was active Nazi efforts throughout the hemisphere. What followed is described in our book, American Dreamer. Another politician, having completed a successful state visit, might have gone home in glory or headed for the beach. Wallace did neither. Instead, he lingered in Mexico for a month, conducting a personal inspection tour of Mexican agriculture. He traced up steep hillsides to see corn grown in mountainous areas, talked about hybrid breeding with Indian farmers and eager students about the work he'd done in Iowa, visited the leading agricultural college in Chapingo, and studied the Mexican diet and farm implements and work patterns. Wallace came away appalled. The very best corn farms he saw in the lowland areas near Zacupa produced only 20 bushels to the acre. A generation earlier, it had produced twice that amount. Most Mexican farms yielded only 10 bushels per acre, and the human labor needed to garner even that amount was heart-sickening. The farmer planted corn with the aid of a pointed stick, weeded and harvested and husked it by hand, and hauled it to market on his own back or on his wife's back or the back of a burro. Wallace returned to Washington and contacted the head of the Rockefeller Foundation. And at his suggestion, the foundation established an international experiment research station in Mexico, from which was born the Green Revolution, that Norman Borlaug did his work on wheat at that center, which of course vastly increased agricultural production and saved the lives of literally billions of people over the next 50 years. Wallace once co-authored a wonderful little book with a great man who headed up Pioneer and was one of the most outstanding corn breeders, William Brown, whose daughter's here, I'm very pleased to say, this evening. And in that book, titled Corn and Its Early Fathers, at the beginning of which the two authors devoted an entire page to this quotation from Jonathan Swift. And he gave it for his opinion that whoever could make 2 ears of corn or 2 blades of grass to grow upon a spot of ground where only one grew before would deserve better of mankind and do more essential service to his country than the whole race of politicians put together. Wallace, with his work in hybrid corn, saw a way to make the equivalent of 2 or 4 ears of corn grow where only one grew before. What is worthwhile? Wallace's beloved grandfather taught him to ask as a young boy. Henry A. Wallace's own life offers an answer. Thank you very much.
You're listening to a special edition of Life and Prairie Life with former United States Senator John C. Culver reading from his book that he co-wrote called American Dream or A Life of Henry A. Wallace. He co-wrote with former Des Moines Register reporter John Hyde. Thanks for having me. I did often first of his tour on this book. Questions now from the Rebroadcast audience here. We're broadcasting from Andrew Auditorium. If you have a question for Senator Culver, there are microphones on both sides of the auditorium. If you would use those so that listeners can hear what you're asking.
Senator Culver, welcome home.
Thank you so much.
In 1948, my husband and our, at that time, one child, went to Green Park here in Iowa City to hear Henry Wallace address the people who were not allowed to meet on the University of Iowa campus because this man was hailed as a communist and that he could not be greeted in the university environment. A sad day.
Which is mentioned in our book. Yeah.
My name is
Yes,
Lee. I was at that park myself. I was a Wallace supporter. And later we had a luncheon in the Jefferson, and I think there was about 30 or 40 people there. Dr. Eldridge, the head of the physics department, was one of the prominent people there. And the story goes that they wouldn't even make his bed. And later in the party, we had a terrible time in Iowa getting his name on the ballot. So we went to Republicans, and they solved the problem for us.
Questions or comments for Senator Culver, feel free to ask.
It's interesting, I might add, I was getting on the ballot.
Yeah.
They did an amazing job.
They kept him off in Illinois.
That's right.
Yeah.
They kept him off in Illinois, they kept him off in Oklahoma,
Yeah.
they kept him off in Nebraska.
Is that right? Yeah.
I think those were the 3. They only had 48 states then.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing was that, please sit, the Dixiecrats, with Strom Thurmond walking out in 48.
Yeah.
And going down south and running on the Dixiecrat ticket, they had a greater ease, the Wallace campaign, on getting on the southern state ballots than anywhere else because they were changing the rules to make room for Strom Thurmond, and they couldn't do that without letting equal access for Henry Wallace and the Progressive Party campaign. It's interesting that the efforts in Illinois by the Republicans to keep him off the ballot really backfired, because had he been on the ballot, that's pretty good likelihood, given the narrowness of the situation there, that it would have thrown the state to Dewey. And so the Republicans made quite a mistake there, because in that generally toward the Wallace campaign and the Progressive Party, because they attacked Wallace rather than letting Wallace take votes and whatnot away from Truman.
I wasn't in Chicago when Glenn Taylor was nominated for the vice president.
Philadelphia.
Okay. I thought that was the night he was actually nominated.
In Shive Park, they nominated him in Philadelphia. That year, all three parties were in Philadelphia. And the reason was that the Republican and Democratic Party agreed to share expenses for having, it was the first televised convention. And secondly, they gave a special rate to the Progressive Party if they would also have their convention there at that time. And they went from the convention out to Shive Park, outdoors, which was unusual, and it was a huge stadium. They charged admission. They charged everything from like 60 cents to $2 or $3. They raised $32,000 on admission, and they raised another $50,000 in the convention, in the park, in the stadium. And where they actually, it paid for all their convention expenses. And one of the remarkable things about the Progressive Party campaign, and Wallace's appeal too in 1947 when he made a tour of the United States, was they had paid admission. And thousands and thousands, huge crowds in California and other places around the country. And the other thing in 48, he was the first candidate for president of the United States to refuse to speak before segregated audiences in the South. And he was subjected to unbelievable abuse and physical danger.
Well, that was picked up at the convention when they go through to pick up his pen and do for the armed forces.
Desegregate the military, yes.
Forces, yeah.
But he made this tour and he refused to sleep in segregated hotels or address segregated audiences, and he was subjected to tomatoes and eggs and a lot of dangerous situations. There was violence in many places. And Glenn Taylor, the vice presidential running mate, a U.S. senator, was running also. This was in the spring of 48 before he was actually nominated for vice president, but he'd agreed to run on the ticket. And it was a very courageous decision for him. He was known as the singing cowboy. He had an 8th grade education, but was a brilliant fellow, one of the finest speakers in the country. He's self-educated, memorized the dictionary, ran 3 or 4 times statewide. He and his wife were traveling troubadours out in Idaho. So he was very courageous in giving up what was the best job he ever had in his life, but as a matter of principle, because he feared the nuclear war. And he went down south in the spring of 48, and he went to Birmingham, Alabama. And believe it or not, the same chief of police in Birmingham, Alabama, in the spring of 1948 was Bull O'Connor, the same one that many of you recall with the racial problems and incidents in the 60s. And Taylor went to a church that had a black entrance and a white entrance. And the police were there in anticipation of his visit to speak at the meeting. And he went into the black entrance of the church. And the police arrested him and physically manhandled him. He tore his suit on barbed wire, thrown to the sidewalk, put him in a police car, and drove him around the city. And he said, I thought they were going to kill me. And they put him in jail. I mean, a sitting U.S. senator. They put him in jail and charged him. And the next morning, they bailed him out. And he returned to the floor of the U.S. Senate wearing the same torn suit, got on the floor to talk about this experience. And John Sparkman of Alabama and Lester Hill of Alabama, really known as moderate in the context of those days, moderate to liberal Southern white senators, walked off the floor. Not one single senator said a word in his defense, and they all left him. So it gave you some sense of the climate of the time. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Senator. For the younger generation in the audience, you're talking a lot about a remarkable character of Henry Wallace, and perhaps besides your son Chet, which modern-day politician, or present-day politician, I should say, in the upcoming presidential election, or generally